Russia and Ukraine occupy just a small portion of the world's GDP, but together, collectively, they account for a huge amount of commodities exports and production. We're here to discuss the scale of the impact of logistical problems and supply chain issues of the Ukrainian war with an expert on supply chain management. He is Dr. Ivo Pezzuto, professor of global economics and competitiveness and digital transformation at the ISM, International School of Management in Paris. Welcome to the show, Professor.
Hi, good morning. Hello, everybody.
Ivo, let's talk about, first of all, Russia and Ukraine's contribution to the commodity space. I'm just going to read a few paragraphs from a research report published recently by Deloitte. It says, according to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, Russia and Ukraine account for more than 25% of the world's trade in wheat and more than 60% of global sunflower oil and 30% of global barley exports. Russia is also a major global exporter of fertilizers, which means any supply shortages or restricted access could impact crop yields globally. Could impact crop yields globally. Let's start with that. What is the impact of this war on food and food supply? Let's start with food first.
Yes, thank you very much. A very interesting question, David. Yes, indeed. I think this report is actually correct. The official statistics tell us that despite the more contribution to global GDP of these two countries, in terms of commodities and raw materials and natural resources, these are powerhouse. These are real powerhouse. And in particular, you mentioned correctly, the sunflower oil and seeds see Russia, Ukraine being really a market dominant position, but also, as you correctly mentioned, wheat, barley, colza seeds, corn, but a lot of critical commodities for today's and tomorrow's strategic industries, like, of course, electric vehicles, rare earth elements, palladium fertilizers, and of course, iron ore, various types of metals, copper, aluminum, and zinc. So it's really a massive impact if you put them all together. We can already see that impact, on the cost of foods because of fertilizers and cereals and metals. And this has significant impact globally, but mostly it will have a significant impact on the emerging developing economies. So those countries that are net importers of basically food and other commodities from abroad. So in particular for food insecurity. So yes, that's really a big point. And, diversifying is not an easy thing to do overnight.
Yes, you're right. It's difficult to swap your suppliers overnight. Now, yes, Russia and Ukraine account for a large portion of the world's global commodities and agricultural products, that's for sure. But how much of this production has actually been impacted? In other words, of all the barley and the wheat that Russia and Ukraine have produced last year, how much of that is cut because of the war?
Well, just keep in mind one thing, that because of the war, the fields in Ukraine, of course, are at serious risk, either being bombarded or of failing to have a reasonable spring in the coming months, and the ability to produce as much as expected. Russia also is continuing to produce, evidently, but one of the because of the embargoes, because of the bans and sanctions, it's also trying to keep the commodities to itself, to protect its internal market rather than to export. So on one side, because of the war, on the other side, because of the internal use and to defend the internal demand from sanctions, stuff like that. Both these factors, together with the problems of the conflict, will definitely create a drastic reduction in the export of these products from these two countries.
Okay, so overall, then, Ivo, what do you think is going to happen to the global food supply? People have talked about a food shortage. Some have even gone as far to say a famine is coming for most countries, especially the emerging markets. Are those an exaggeration, do you think, or is that actually going to happen?
Well, yeah, well, it might be, stretched a little bit, but definitely the problem is that there might be worse shortages that we have seen so far, and it might be also rising prices together with the other issues that we are facing right now, which is basically the ones of the shortages, bottlenecks, and backlogs. So if you put them all together, even if you source them from elsewhere, like, for example, South America has got an opportunity over there, Argentina and other countries, it's still, there's still going to be challenges with the backlogs, transportation, shipping, and stuff like that. Yeah, so I think it might not cause the worst case scenario, but definitely it might have some issues. And we know from history, from previous events, that when these things happen, there is also some social unrest, and we've seen that already in the last few weeks. With Sri Lanka, with some countries, in Egypt, some problems in some Arab and African countries, Sri Lanka, as I was saying, but also other countries that had experienced some turmoils and some problems like Peru and so on.
Ivo, I remember the start of the pandemic 2 years ago. People were going to Costco and the grocery stores and stockpiling on as much canned food and preserved food and toilet paper as they can. I'm not seeing this panic right now. In fact, I haven't seen that since the pandemic. So maybe ordinary citizens, at least where I live in North America, are not as concerned about a food shortage as maybe they should be, or maybe they're right that it's not really going to impact people in the West. What do you think?
Well, it might not impact the way we've seen with the COVID-19, but if you look at the statistics about the US and the drivers of inflation, the latest statistics, you can see that in the US, the inflation has been, consumer price index has been affecting in the period between 2020 and more recently, all different categories, from energy to food to other factors, not just energy, like mostly in Europe or in other parts of the world. US, it's more widespread because of these transportation costs, because of the energy prices, because of the things we might just mentioned before. So it might not happen, but you might have significant shortages and backlogs and higher prices, which might affect, as it is, the advanced countries have on average 5.7% in inflation, whereas the 8.7% at emerging markets. So if you couple this, if you combine this with the tightening monetary policy from the Fed, rising interest rates and stuff like that, then you might see perhaps a simultaneous slowdown of the economy gradually, and also rising prices. And the two things together are not so, positive. That's one of the reasons why I think recently you've seen that even, Janet Yellen, the Secretary for the Treasury in the U.S., has been advocating for, don't go too far with the embargo on Russian oil, because as it is oil, it's there's pressure on inflationary pressures on energy, and gasoline has been expensive even in the U.S. Maybe it's not running out in terms of shortages, but definitely prices are rising, and there is some concerns about going further down with more bans, with more, this could be more problems with that, with the consumers.
Okay, Ivo, I want to look at some forecasts by other economists, and then I want to get your view on how the war in Ukraine is likely to end and what that means for global growth. So the IMF has recently released, just last week actually, an update to the global outlook. And I'm just going to read the first two paragraphs and give you their update. It says, the war in Ukraine has triggered a costly humanitarian crisis that demands a peaceful resolution. At the same time, economic damage from the conflict will contribute to a significant slowdown in global growth in 2022 and add to inflation. Fuel and food prices have increased rapidly, hitting vulnerable populations in low-income countries hardest. Global growth is projected to slow from an estimated 6.1% in 2021 to 3.6% in 2022 and 2023. This is 0.8% and 0.2 percentage points lower for 2022 and 2023 than projected in January. So they have downgraded, Ivo. They've downgraded the global growth forecast. They said significantly, but really it's just 0.8% for next year and then 0.2% for the following year in 2023. First of all, I want to ask you whether or not you agree with the outlook that global growth will slow down in the next 2 years. But also, it's interesting because they stated that global growth will only be 3.6% in 2023, which is only 0.2 percentage points lower than their last forecast. So more or less, they're saying that by 2023, global growth will more or less stabilize, and the Ukrainian war will not have a lasting impact beyond 2022, is what I'm reading from their message. Right? Do you agree?
Yeah. Well, well, the point that I see is that the way they are estimating, forecasting this data, evidently assumes that their scenario assumes that the baseline scenario assumes that war will mainly remain restricted to Ukraine. The sanctions on Russia will not tighten further. That more lethal form of COVID does not arrive. The tightening of monetary policy in U.S. and elsewhere would be relatively modest, and there would be no major financial shock or from distressed debt on the emerging market. So it's really a baseline scenario. It does not consider the worsening of the conflicts, more ban, more embargo, more restrictions to trade for Russia, and a worsening of the global trade and monetary tightening. So it could be seen like a baseline, but not necessarily an adverse scenario. If you consider that by and large, what we have today and what we've been experiencing in this past weeks is that we have situations in which basically the shortages and the all the other elements that we have been mentioning so far are quite are quite challenging. In particular, in the food market and in the energy market, we could see the congested ports and all other stuff. This could be worse if it lasts a bit longer than expected. So this is really very important to consider.
What is your view? How is the war going to end, and how long will it take to end?
Well, basically, it very much depends on the global agreements that multilateral organizations and international big players will play in this negotiation phase. In other words, it depends very much on the role of China, the role of Europe, the role of United States, how far they want to go before they sit at the negotiation. So, as I said, the pandemic effects are still affecting the global trade, congested port, supply and demand mismatch, the shipping logjam, rising inflation, increasing freight rates, shortages, disruption in the trade and supply chain, and all the things that we mentioned. So evidently, if you stretch it very long, that would cause significant disruptions globally. So it really depends on how far that would go. And I would say that this is an opportunity right now, despite the crazy moment. It's an opportunity to rethink the global order, the global economic, the globalization itself. Now, we used to be in a unipolar world led by US for many decades. Now we are in a sort of bipolar world with US, China being the big player. Maybe we are going to move in a multipolar world, or in a re-globalizations based on an important role. So it's very important that US and China play a critical role with the other, multilateral and international players in defining new order in terms of trade agreements, in terms of new supply chain and trade frameworks that they work on solving the conflict, solving the disruption in supply chain,
right.
rethinking the model. It's very important because otherwise, if you push this too far, then you're going to have digitizing the supply chains, transportation, working on trade liberalization, in other words, finding an agreement on a new framework. Otherwise, if you stretch it too far, eventually between rising inflation, rising interest rates, and disruptions in the supply chain and other elements, inevitably there will be some kind of shock that might cause weaker countries, more vulnerable countries and communities to be negatively affected for a longer time. So it's really like the problem is that as usual is going to be on the weaker, more vulnerable countries. That's what happens. The China eventually, if the United States will go ahead in this and Europe in this in this confrontation with the bans and embargo with the Ukraine and with Russia. Eventually, Europe, Ukraine, and U.S. will be the ones most exposed to eventually retaliations, including the weaker, as we say, the weaker economies from the emerging markets, the ones that are net importers, that balance of payments imbalances, the ones that have structural economic fundamentals that are weak, and the ones that are basically they have depreciating currencies and rising inflation and capital flight. Those would be mostly affected, but probably in this scenario, eventually China will come out as a winner.
China will come out as the winner. I want to come back to what you said earlier about how other nations are being involved, right? The U.S. is escalating its aid to Ukraine as we speak. A couple of days ago, President Biden announced an additional $800 million in military aid to Ukraine. Russia has complained that NATO is fighting a proxy war in Ukraine. And recently, as you know, one of their flagship Navy ships was sunk by, well, the Ukrainian claimed responsibility. The Russians said it was an accident on board. But anyway, it looks like the war is escalating. So let's just circle back. Final thoughts on how the war is likely to progress from here. And it comes back to your thesis on, economic outlook, because if you think this war is going to continue to escalate, well, potentially we're seeing more negative economic impacts, right? But if you're saying, Ivo, if you're saying that, David, it's all fine, the military aid will stop, the military escalation will stop soon, then maybe it will return to normal.
Well, the point is this. Let's, as I mentioned before, if we escalate, we know for sure what the first losers that we mentioned before, the net importers, the ones that depend significantly on energy, food from these countries, the ones that have imbalances, balance of payments, excess foreign debt denominated in foreign hard currencies, distress debt, vulnerable economic fundamentals. Those are the ones that for sure will lose the war. Then, of course, even Europe and will be affected because of the dependency. But eventually, let's remember just one thing: what happened in Vietnam, which destabilized the U.S. finances. What happened to the Korean War in 1950, 1953, and what happened to Yom Kippur in 1973? They all had a spillover effect globally, and not just like in 70. No, and just let's not forget one last example. In 1998, there was a default of Russia when Russia defaulted on its debt. In 1998, there was also the event of long-term capital management demise, which we all know, which was exposed to Russian government bonds. And basically, as we all remember, the long-term capital management was also basically an event that affected this hedge fund.
Yes.
And we know that the consequences that caused and that what we had in the following years. So there's no such thing as no spillover effect globally.
Okay, spillover effects then. What's the word? Okay, can we see a recession in the U.S. from Ukraine?
Of course, we can see stagflation and recession. Of course, maybe it's not going to happen this year. Maybe it's going to happen next year.
But a recession, negative economic growth.
Yeah, we can have it. Yes,
we can have it.
But we can have it if the central bank will raise interest rates, or they will unwind the balance sheet too quickly because of the rising pressure on inflation, because they want to keep anchored inflation expectations, because they want to avoid destroying the purchasing power, and that's definitely possible. This depends very much on how far they will go on raising interest rates and fighting inflation. If they want, they can have a stagflation, but not just in the US in 1 year. Don't forget one thing, and you saw this today. China is having big problems with congested ports, backlogs, COVID, and the zero COVID policy, which will have an effect in 1 month's time. And these situations might get worse and might accumulate with others. So if they want to navigate inflation without jeopardizing the recovery globally, if they want to have a good trade-off between energy security and climate change transition, if they want to avoid disanchoring inflation expectations and guarantee growth, they need to find solutions to this conflict soon.
Ivo, the IMF in their opening paragraph on the report didn't state that COVID-19 is going to play a big role in the global economic slowdown that they're projecting. As we're speaking, China is going through a series of lockdowns that are spooking markets. Investors are concerned this is going to cause global supply chain issues as well. Can you comment on that? Do you think China's lockdowns will cause a significant slowdown?
Yes, of course. Yes.
Significant slowdown, like it's going to impact everybody in the West.
Well, as you know, they've been locking down the entire city. We're talking about 25 million people. And they are talking about having more than one city in the same situation. Of course, it's possible. That's why I think this would be the perfect time for US to sit at the table with China and say, we can help you with vaccines. And we can find an agreement together on Russia. Because China needs US like US needs China. And US has wonderful vaccines, which improve situation significantly in the Western countries. They could sit at the table with China and they can help them solve.
What is the risk, do you think, of a lockdown, a major lockdown in the West in the style of China? Again, we've had lockdowns in the past. What do you think is the chance of that happening again?
Well, of course it can happen. Of course it can happen. Only that we are assuming that the vaccines we are using in the West are able to reduce hospitalizations, are able to reduce the most critical events of deaths and of emergency care, stuff like that. So it's not like in the West we don't have it. We have a widespread problem still around. It's just that with the vaccines we developed so far, we have been able to manage it more effectively, including the containment. So that's why I said US has an incredible opportunity right now to help China solve its problem, and China will have a great opportunity to help US and the rest of the West and NATO address the issue of Russia.
And closing thoughts, Ivo, what do you think, looking around at all these issues, geopolitical tensions in Eastern Europe, COVID in China, and other things, what do you think are the biggest risks to global growth right now, and what can we do to mitigate these risks?
Well, basically, the biggest risk to global growth right now, it's number one, the conflict. And the uncertainty about the conflict more than the conflict. Because the conflict brings uncertainty for entrepreneurs, for investors, and the fear.
But it's more or less localized, right? I mean, the counter-argument is it's just between Russia and Ukraine. Why should people in France or Italy, where you live, be concerned?
That's a good point. But again, first of all, Europe, it's, we consider Ukraine close by. It's like in the US, if you have something happening in Texas, somebody will be concerned even in the
Yeah.
neighboring countries. But besides that, I think that definitely growth is a very important element. Why I say inflation, why I say conflict? Because even more than COVID right now, I think growth and inflation are the biggest concerns. Shortages, growth, and inflation. Why? Because the world is overwhelmed with debt. Over the decades, since 2008 and after the pandemic, the world has accumulated private, public debt, and corporate debt, an incredible level of debt. Now, because of the rising inflation and the risk that we might have rising inflation expectations or decelerating inflation expectations, or the monetary policy and central banks might not be very effective in containing this inflation. Let's not forget that one thing, that even if central banks raise the interest rates, that might be quite effective or quite good in the US, where demand has been, very strong. In other parts of the world, inflation is not driven only by reopening the economy after pandemic and rising demand and pent-up demand. This is due also to rising input prices, rising cost of commodities and energy in particular. So this means basically that even if you raise your interest rates, it doesn't mean necessarily that you can contain inflation because sometimes it's related to supply and not necessarily only to demand. In the US, it would be both, but in other parts of the world. So in that sense, the inflation and also, as I said, the conflict and growth are very important, because the fear is that by raising interest rates, one of the biggest risks is that we're going to slow down the recovery process, not just in one country, but more countries. So inflation has it's a double sword, in the sense, on one side, it forces an increase in interest rates, which slow down economies, and the second might slow down economies depending on the speed. And the other side, inflation may also cause problems with demand, which means somehow the growth might not be guaranteed. And when you have a huge debt and you have to repay the debt, you have to consolidate the debt, you need fiscal consolidation process, you need growth. And
yes.
We need growth. We need on a global scale. We need growth. So too much debt, too much inflation and tightening, monetary tightening, could be a risk for growth, for sustained growth in the long run.
Excellent, Ivo. I appreciate your thoughts. Excellent insights, and welcome back to KITCO. I look forward to speaking with you again next time. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. All the best.
Thank you for watching KITCO News. I'm David Lin.